Welcome anybody who's watching online. Hope you're doing well. We're in chapter 4 of Ruth, and we're going to have a wedding tonight. Hope you brought rice with you. This is the final act of the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, and it concludes with two scenes here. The legal setting of the court, which is where the marriage is going to take place, and then 9 months later, which is the birth of Obed-Edom. Actually, just Obed. Obed-Edom is somebody else. Obed-Edom is the person where the glory of God was when the ark got misplaced and ended up with the Philistines, and David wanted to bring it back, and so he dropped it off at Obed-Edom's house. Different Obed. This is Obed. Obed being the grandfather of David. The first scene divides into 4 readily identifiable segments. Number 1, Boaz's preparation for the court action. See that in verse 1 and 2. The transcript of the court proceedings, verses 3 through 8. Boaz's response to the outcome, verses 9 through 10. And then public reaction. This is where, who's the girl on CNN that does all the court stuff? Something Grace. She shows up, interviews everybody. Nancy Grace, yeah, she shows up, interviews everybody. The opening segment of the scene 1 shifts attention to Boaz. So we've been talking about Ruth and Naomi for the most part. Now the attention is shifting to Boaz, because Boaz is the person who has all the leverage here. He's the one who's got to take all the action. So he's going to become the main character here in chapter 4, at least the first part. Ruth's future, Naomi's future were at stake, but the focus is on Boaz, because he is the what? He's the what? He's the kinsman redeemer. It's Boaz who calls for the proceedings. He notices that there's another kinsman redeemer who is closer to Ruth than he is. He's doing all the acting. All the other actors are reacting. So he's active, they're passive. Boaz is moving forward with clear purpose in mind. The scene takes place at the city gate. To give you an idea about how they did things legally and politically in the day, the city gate was not just a physical place. It was the place where these kind of proceedings went forth. You'll read that in a lot of places in Scripture. This happened at the city gate. Absalom stood at the city gate and spoke bad about his dad, David. People will go to the city gate and will say this: the city gate is a place of power, it is a place of influence, it's a place of civic, legal significance in the culture. It seems that Boaz has come straight from the threshing floor when he was outside the gate and came straight to the gate without going home first. When the kinsman passed by Boaz, Boaz invited him to sit down with him. And once the kinsman is in place, Boaz took 10 elders from the city to sit in on proceedings. Jury, basically. He went and rounded up the 10 elders. The fact that they left work and followed Boaz would indicate what kind of influence he had. They left their threshing floors. They left their wine presses. Let's read verse 1 and 2. Now Boaz went up to the gate, sat down there, and behold, the close relative whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. So he calls them into court. Let's read verse 3 through verse 8. Then he said to the close relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech." Aren't you glad your name's not Elimelech? I'd go as Lech or Lim. Probably Lim. "And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." So what we have here is we have not just Naomi and Ruth involved, it's real estate. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess." See, up until verse 4, all that this kinsman knows about is the real estate. You don't know about Ruth. The wife of the dead, to perpetuate his name. And the close relative says, I can't redeem it for myself lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself. I cannot. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal, gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal. He took off his Johnston Murphy sandal and gave it to him. That's a whole lot better than the oath that they did with Abraham and Jacob, where they had to put his hand into their thigh. I would not want to do that. That's a weird custom. Boaz gets to the heart of the matter by identifying a piece of land that Naomi is selling, and he informs the man that he is the kinsman redeemer. So you have the right of first refusal here. It's your lot to buy it back. I'm next in line. According to Mosaic law, this land was never to leave the family. This was big, you know. Sometimes I wish it was that way. You could buy a piece of property and finance it for 100 years and your grandkids pay it off. They would end up getting all the equity. So that's not a good deal. Boaz tells him the owner of this land is our brother Elimelech. He gives Boaz his sandal and tells him to redeem Naomi's property and marry Ruth. Why? Because when Ruth is involved, it has something to do with messing up his inheritance. What? I don't really know. But he kind of reneges on the initial deal. I'll do it, then I won't. Verse 9 and 10, you get Boaz's response. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. So Boaz makes a speech that commissions the assembly as his witnesses as to what just happened. He summarizes his role. He states that he has redeemed all that belonged to Elimelech and his sons. He then claims Ruth as his wife, Mahlon's widow. This is the first time in which we learned which one she was married to. We didn't know which one. If it was Mahlon or Chilion, we didn't know. He then states his purpose: to maintain the estate, to maintain the name of his family, and to maintain his name among public record. That's kind of strange, you know, that. And I wonder how this worked. In that, how Mahlon's name is continued. I mean, Boaz is about to father a child. It's his child. But he's the kinsman redeemer. I'm not sure how that works. You know, his motivation here is largely Ruth. Both men are a close relationship to Elimelech, but Boaz, this need for the court was due to Naomi's decision to sell a piece of land. But that's not all what this is about. This is about Ruth. This is about redeeming her. He may not have been doing this at all had she not come to him at the threshing floor. Remember, she asked him to marry her. There's a problem with this whole thing with a piece of land because according to Mosaic tradition, women or widows didn't sell land. They didn't own land, they couldn't sell land. But if she isn't selling the land, what is she doing? According to law, Naomi could not sell it, but she could authorize the court to give it to or transfer it to the next of kin. She couldn't sell it. She could authorize the court for it to be transferred. She is in fact giving up the right to reclaim it in the year of Jubilee. So in other words, she's saying, I don't want it. Year of Jubilee every 50 years, remember? Land is returned. Debts are forgiven. What a wonderful thing that would be. You've got to live a long time. Nowhere does it say that Naomi ever talked about giving away or redeeming the land, but Boaz knew that it was related to getting Ruth. The land and Ruth were tied to each other. They were a package deal. Now Boaz explains his involvement in the case. He took it upon himself to inform the next of kin of this transaction, and he suggests that he redeem it in the presence of these witnesses. Boaz is wanting this man to state his intentions. Boaz is a straight shooter, and he did not want to Mickey Mouse around.
So was Naomi.
Yeah. But she knew that about Boaz.
Right.
Remember, she tells Ruth, whatever he tells you to do, you do. This man will not wait until this matter is settled. Yeah. She knew who she was dealing with. A man that's decisive, but a man of character. And his character compelled his decisiveness, that he would do the right thing. Boaz concludes that he has a right to know the other man's intentions because he, Boaz, is next in line. You know, you need to make up your mind because I'm next in line. Verse 4d, he says, I will redeem it. Can you imagine what Ruth would have felt if she'd have been listening in if the other guy, which he did say it, I will redeem it. But he didn't know about Ruth yet. Why has Boaz not mentioned Ruth yet? Any guesses? In verse 5, Boaz introduces Ruth as a complication to the case. And from Ruth the Moabitess, you obtain a dead man's widow. One thing to get the land, it's another thing to get responsibility for taking care of somebody. Boaz is saying that this deal is a bit more complex. Elimelech had a son who had a wife. Any transaction of land involves her. Notice the way he introduces her. How does he introduce her?
As a caveat or a problem.
Yeah, but what else does he call her?
An issue.
A widow.
No, we're not there yet. We're dancing around it. The very first thing he says, Ruth the Moabitess,
Right.
the wife of the dead. So
He introduces her as a foreigner.
she's a foreigner.
Right.
She's a foreigner. And that's a piece of information that I don't think is, he understands the culture. And the culture of that time did not embrace somebody who was not Jewish born. But he would. I think this is a redemptive piece of information. I don't want to make more of this than I should. But Ruth is a Moabitess. She's not a Jew. And her character in her loyalty and faithfulness to Naomi is to be spoken of. But then now, Boaz, his character, the fact that she was a foreigner, wasn't a big issue for him because he saw her character. He saw the way she cared for Naomi. He saw the way she conducted herself at his property.
Yeah, come on now.
So he saw character there. Now what I love about it is that, and we'll see this a little bit later, is that something that this man, this closer redeemer, rejected, Boaz embraced, and God blessed by making her the grandmother of David. And in the line that would produce Jesus. That's powerful. Boaz is saying, if you want to rescue Elimelech's land, you must also rescue his line. This meant you marry Ruth and you father a child. Not just marry her.
Right.
You marry her, and, let nature take its course and you father a child. Technically, according to Mosaic law, neither Boaz nor his rival had to marry Ruth and preserve the line, but Boaz is challenging himself and his rival to go a step further than what the law required. And that's powerful. Go above and beyond. And the reason why they're not required is because neither of them were Mahlon's brother. Okay? But Boaz is willing to acknowledge the spirit of the law. See, he's not looking at the letter of the law. He's looking at the spirit of the law. And what he sees here is not a legal obligation, but what he believes is a moral obligation. To take care of family. We have two sets of concern here. The preservation of the estate and the preservation of the family line. For our purpose and that of the narrator, the second is more important because of what? Or rather, should I say, because of who? David. David's coming. In verse 6, the kinsman changes his mind. He can't redeem it. The kinsman did not have to marry Ruth. He could have bought the field and reneged on a pledge to marry Ruth, but this would cost him in terms of the respect of his peers. In other words, he didn't have to marry her. He could have just took the land and said, you do what you want to with Ruth. But he didn't. He chose to let Boaz redeem the field and marry Ruth. He said, I can't, lest I jeopardize my estate. Maybe he worried that a child with Ruth would knock his own family out of inheriting what he already had. Maybe he didn't want a Moabitess for a wife. For whatever reason, he thought the cost of redemption was too high. Let's think about the cost of redemption that Jesus paid. He paid with his own life. Philippians said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who thought it not robbery to be considered equal with God, but emptied himself, made himself of no reputation, taking form of a servant, making himself obedient unto death, even death on a cross. What a high price. Verse 7 and 8, the narrator interrupts the proceedings to give us a procedural note on ancient custom. This is the whole sandal business. Okay, perhaps this custom was outdated by the time the book was written, and people no longer understood it, and that's why he's explaining it. That can happen. Because if it's not, then people would know, and he wouldn't have to really say that. But he not only tells you what he did, he explains it. Now, this was the custom in former times. So that tells you he's writing for a later audience. This is what they did. Public reaction to what happened. We see this in verse 11 and verse 12. Verse 10 is where Boaz is declaring what he's done. I've bought property. I've acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I've acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. The name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren from position at the gate. You are his witnesses. Verse 11 and 12. And the people who were at the gate, the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. Well, they had no idea what they were talking about. They were being prophetic. And may you prosper in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. This is public reaction. Nancy Grace is out there with a microphone, and she sticks a microphone in the mouth of these people who are witnesses, and they give you basically three blessings. To bless them and pray for Ruth's fertility. Again, fertility is very much a symbol and a signal of the Lord's blessing. Build up the house. Item 2, may you prosper and have standing in Bethlehem. So may your household's influence expand. Fertility, blessing, and favor. Number 3, may your house be like Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, rather. The connection here is strictly that of a Levirate or Levi union, that the way Tamar conceived the children. So that's the only connection there. But you have here, because Tamar was half sister of Judah. Okay. Any questions through verses 12? Now let's look at verse 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. You know, there's no real indication of how long she was married to Mahlon, but perhaps it could be as long as 10 years.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So if he took Ruth and the land, and they reneged on marrying Ruth, wouldn't that land return in Jubilee? Wouldn't he lose? You know, he'd be invested in land that he was going to lose again.
I don't know, because he wasn't a brother, so I don't really know.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So would that have to transfer back to that family?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Then the women said to Naomi, getting back to I don't know how long Ruth was married to Mahlon. She didn't have any kids. So you don't want to underappreciate the phrase, the Lord gave her conception.
Amen.
Because she hadn't conceived with Mahlon for whatever reason. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." What a powerful statement. Do you realize how powerful a statement that is to a person in an agrarian society where you either raising crops or you're raising some kind of livestock, and you're a woman in that day? You were at the mercy of whatever the men were in your life.
I think we see that though all the way back when Ruth starts saying, "I will go with you."
Yeah.
And your people will be my people. You know what I'm saying?
Your God will be my God.
Your God will be my God. And so and then Naomi takes her and teaches her to not just speak Aramaic or Hebrew, but to speak through actions. And not, communicate through her activity.
Yeah.
And that was just powerful all by itself.
Verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son born to Naomi." That's strategic.
Yes. Yes.
And they called his name Obed, and he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. The Lord enabled Ruth to conceive. Verse 13 telescopes 9 months of personal history. Boaz married Ruth. Boaz took Ruth. The phrase "he took" is symbolic in ancient Near Eastern and biblical terms, inasmuch as it was the man's responsibility to establish and maintain the home. In marrying Boaz, Ruth's social progression was complete. Foreigner, lowest servant, maidservant, wife. It's that old statement, "You come a long way, baby." She came a long way.
Yeah.
And just the way the Lord promoted that gift, to promote her because of her character and her commitment. She worked in the fields that she would one day own with humility, with grace, assuming nothing, taking nothing for granted, no entitlement mentality whatsoever. I don't mean to speak ill of the disenfranchised or the indigent. And we give, our church gives. But, in a few days our phones will ring off the hook here for Thanksgiving baskets that we do every year, 100 Thanksgiving baskets that we feed, and I want all of you to give for that. I'll have to raise about $1,000 to help underwrite that. And I get folks calling, and then they have a demanding spirit. And we're doing something for them because we care. We don't have to. Where's my basket? I come to get my basket. And if you do 100, and that's what we do, and you run out, that's somehow your fault. There was none of that in Ruth. She was not at that at all. Boaz went in to her. Another Old Testament phrase, he knew his wife. Now, you need to understand about the language of Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament, the word for to know is the word yada. It is the word to know as in a husband knows his wife. Intimate, relational. Okay? New Testament, the word for know is gnosko. It's very Greek. It's very much up here. And so when the New Testament is talking about the kind of relationship that God wants to happen with us, he's not talking about gnosko up here. He's talking about relational. Yada. He's talking about that. And so Boaz knew his wife. The Lord enabled her to conceive. We can assume for up to 10 years with Mahlon, she was barren. Can you imagine being a widow, but being a widow who was also childless, barren? She thought she was doubly cursed. Think about this miracle for her. She's been redeemed, she's been married, and now she's going to have a baby. It is as if they see the baby and Ruth as more than ample compensation for the son she lost. This is with Naomi. I need to turn a page over. This is the only page in my stack that's got something on both sides, and that's why I got confused. The women say to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer." Interpret this against the backdrop of chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. The one who the Lord had emptied. Now go back to chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. Naomi's returning. They're calling her, the same women are calling her, "Naomi, sweetness, you have returned." And she says, "Don't call me Naomi. I'm not sweet. Call me Mara. I'm bitter, and God did it." So contrast this with what happened there. God turned it all around. This woman who was emptied was about to be filled. Who was the Redeemer, Boaz or the child? Legally, it was Boaz, but the child in terms of redeeming Naomi's dream. She lost her sons. She lost her husband. This was a child that she would basically raise as her own. Verse 14b, blessing of the child, Boaz and Yahweh, may his name be called, is a better rendering. May his fame live on in Israel. The women's attention in verse 15 turned to the implications of the birth of the boy. He will be a restorer of life. He, the child, will be a restorer of life. She will find new hope for life through this child. He will sustain you in old age. Your future will be secure in him. For your daughter-in-law, who's better to you than all these sons. What did it say? 7 sons?
Yes.
Wow. Better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. It's as if they see the baby and Ruth as more than ample compensation for the sons that she lost. powerful full circle story that it's of redemption. Somebody who's lost everything, and now she's holding on her lap essentially what is her grandson. She lost her sons, but she gained a daughter. And what a daughter she was. She took the child in her bosom. She became his nanny. Some would interpret this as a wet nurse. That would be a miracle. Possible with God, but not likely in terms of the text. That would be imposing a miracle on the text where there isn't one. But she did care for him as her own son, and God gave her a son. Verse 17, a son has been born to Naomi, named Obed. That name literally means one who serves. This son is Naomi's redeemer. He redeems her pain. He doesn't erase it. It's something you understand about the way God works. He didn't come in and make it as if the pain never happened. He redeemed it. That's what you need to understand about the way the Lord works in your pain and in my pain. God's not going to waste anything. He's not going to wipe the slate clean to where you can no longer reach back to that and be able to draw that out and use that as a reservoir. And that can't happen until it's redeemed. But when he redeems it, then that which is utterly painful becomes a reservoir. I was praying and thinking today, and I don't know if I'll preach on this Sunday or not because it's really in a very small seed thought. And you gotta have more than a seed thought to preach on. But this whole notion of the megaphone of personal experience, particularly painful experience. And I was thinking about Job, where Job says, after the Lord comes and restores everything. I wrote a paper on this 25 years ago when I was in seminary. And the verse that Job says, for my ears had once heard of you, but now have my eyes seen you. It's one thing to hear about God, read about God, live through the experiences with God of other people. It's another thing to have a first-hand experience. And you can't have that first-hand experience without a whole lot of pain.
That's a fact.
When Paul says, I may preach on this, I'm getting it now. When Paul says in Philippians 3 and 10 that I may know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, you can't know God without both.
That's right. That's right.
You cannot have a first-hand experience with God without identifying with Christ in pain. And so all this goofy theology out there that says if you have the right confession, you can just kind of brush that pain away, that's not in the book. And why would I want to do that? Now, to get out of the hot seat and provide some kind of spiritual and emotional analgesic that will help me feel better is one thing. But you miss everything else.
Come on now.
You miss, if that's the case, the pain redeems the experience when God gets involved with it. This is why mothers, when they really want to guilt trip their child, tell them, I was in labor with you for however many hours. Because that pain experience, it really authenticates what happened. If that was easy.
Yes. Paul embraced the fellowship of his suffering.
Yeah, from a jail cell.
Yeah.
Because he's writing the book of Philippians largely from the Mamertine prison in the hole in the ground in Rome.
Yes.
Been beaten. He's underground. I love it when he gives his resume of all the things that he endured. Shipwrecked, beaten, 39 stripes. How many times he got that? I don't believe in masochism. I don't believe in sadism. I don't believe in seeking out suffering. But I do believe in when you are suffering, look for the redemption. And here's the problem is sometimes the pain can be so excruciating it's hard to find. But you have to trust God. It's one thing to walk in the dark night of the soul. It's another thing when that dark night becomes years. And a chronic health issue. But God can even redeem that. Fill that out. So has anybody filled that out, Moses? God redeems her pain, doesn't erase it. He makes her losses meaningful. He doesn't eradicate them.
Come on, man.
He redeems. I wonder about, I've always often wondered, and that's basically the end. I mean, we know the last few verses give you basically the genealogy. I wonder how, look at Job. Look at the things that Job lost. I don't think anybody lost more than Job, ever. He lost all of his possessions. He lost 10 children. 10. He has boils on every inch of his skin, scraping them with pottery, sitting on a garbage heap. He is falsely accused and maligned by people who are showing up to comfort him. His wife encourages him to commit suicide, so he even loses her for a little while. But then at the end of that, when he sees God, really sees God, and God finally shows up and speaks to his situation, he redeems everything that he lost. And yeah, he gets everything back. He gets, those 10 little children are not going to replace the 10 that you lost. He gets 10 children. He gets all this stuff. He gets his health back. His wife had to have 10 more babies, so I guess she paid for some of her foolishness. But you never, when he sees God and God speaks to him, he's a different man. All the things that he lost. And I think that's the message of when redemption really comes. Yeah. When it really comes, it'll be worth it. When Paul says in Romans 8:18, "For I reckon the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed in us." He's talking about heaven there. And that's the critical part that you need to understand, is that not all redemption happens on this side. It doesn't. Gordon Mote, who's a blind piano player for the Gaithers, he doesn't play for them like he used to. Gordon Mote's got a song called "On the Other Side of Time." And I really hadn't been able to really grieve the death of my mother really well. And I was driving home to see my dad, and I was listening to that CD, or it's not a CD, it's on a thumb drive now. On the other side of time, broken things are healed, and empty things are filled as we dance in heaven's light. But it says there's in the bridge it says there are no guarantees that life will always be fair, but the debt this life owes us will all be settled there. And so sometimes the redemption doesn't come in this life. Sometimes it comes in the next life. And we have to believe that. But I also believe that if you survive it, that God will use it. You just have to be willing to let him show you how to do that. He can redeem what you go through. I don't know how he does it, but he can. Even the worst things. It's pretty bad to lose your husband, both your kids. It'd be pretty bad to lose all 10 of your kids and all your possessions. But God can redeem it. Any questions or comments? We got about 12 minutes. 14 minutes. Barry, anything?
Yeah. I always remember a guy telling me, he says, and you said something about it earlier while we lead into those things, and we do all go through pressure, tribulation on this side. Jesus said we would. But he said a long time ago, he said, why did Jesus go to the wedding at Cana in Galilee?
Because he was invited.
Because he was invited.
There may be an indication there
So we
that
can invite him into every situation. You know, we can. So every time I find myself in a place where I don't want to be, or I want to scream out and be mad. I mean, scream at God instead of to Him. I find myself just inviting Him,
yeah.
and it makes it.
Whoa.
What is going on, man?
Went from crawling to chewing.
Yeah, they're all sitting in the dark. Siri, turn on the flashlight. Read the Psalms, read Lamentations. You know, some of the things that David went through and experienced, and the way that he states all of that. I wonder what the name it claim it crowd do. Do they just not read that part of the scripture?
There's a bunch of them out there.
Do y'all just not read that part of scripture? You know, where David is just, you know, he is just he's desperate. What do you do with that? What do you do with Paul, the guy who, of course, he's rewriting what Habakkuk said, the just shall live by faith. Well, Paul, if you had enough faith, you wouldn't have been in that prison. Where does that nonsense come from? That is so weird. That's just weird. God can redeem anything. And the story of Ruth now, I encourage you to get the book. Go to Amazon and get the book Shattered Dreams by Larry Crabb.
In our Amazon cart.
It's an old book. It's probably that book's probably 20 years old, maybe older. He wrote a book I referenced earlier called Moving Through Your Problems Toward Finding God. I read that back in 1995. That was my first introduction to Larry Crabb. Then his big book that was his claim to fame was called Inside Out. But the best book, I've read probably about half a dozen of his books, but the best book that I ever read, the one that had the most long-term impact, was Shattered Dreams. Powerful look at the book of Ruth. It'll mess you up.
Thanks for the heads up.
It will mess you up. But it just, what it gets you to is we, you know, Naomi, when she left Israel to go to Moab, she left full. That's what she said. I left full, I came back empty. Mm-hmm. She went with the dream of her husband, her 2 sons, to build a new life. And when she did, she was shattered when she came back. And what the message of the book of Ruth is, and the message of Crabb's treatment of it in this book, is that we frequently will take what we believe to be the blessed life, you know, the spouse, the kids, the house, the cars, the health, and all of that, and hold that up as this is really what's blessed. And sometimes God will let those things crumble to give us His dream. And it may not look like what we think it is supposed to look like. So, all right. God bless you. We're done. Are you out there rattling around out there, Moses? What's all that noise out there?
No.
Is it you?
It's just the kids.
Okay. All right. God bless you.
Thank you.
See you Sunday.